The Agitator's Daughter is the name of the book, and Sheryll Cashin is the author. She's also a professor of law here at Georgetown University. Professor Cashin, who's the agitator?
My dad, Dr. John Cashin Jr., who may rest in peace. He just passed this past year. Yeah.
What kind of an agitator was he?
Well, my dad founded an independent Democratic Party in Alabama at a time when the regular Democratic Party was dominated by George Wallace and the Dixiecrats. And despite being a dentist and a two-time valedictorian, his avocation was agitation, and he poured hundreds of thousands of dollars of his own money. This is in the 60s, mind you. 60s and early 70s into this political party so that Alabamians could vote for Lyndon Johnson rather than George Wallace, and the hundreds of thousands of newly registered black voters would have people to vote for, could not just vote but also run for office. And so that was his life's work, and he was very much committed to recapturing the greatness of African Americans in terms of political participation. He was very steeped in the era of Reconstruction because his grandfather had been a Reconstruction legislator, and he grew up hearing about his grandfather, Grandpa Herschel, while he was coming of age in Jim Crow, and it radicalized him to be living under Jim Crow in Alabama while hearing about the fact that black people used to actually have political power and be in office, including his own family.
Well, who was Sheryll Cashin?
That was my great-grandfather. Handsome man, isn't he? He was, in our family lore, Sheryll Cashin was the first black lawyer in the state of Alabama and the architect of Reconstruction. You know, I grew up listening to my father repeat this over and over, you know, and as a teenager my eyes would roll. And in this book I go off in search of the source of my father's passions, and I find out that the outlines of the lore are there, but he was admitted to the Alabama bar in 1878.
To the Alabama bar? To
the Alabama bar. Not the first, but the fourth colored lawyer in the state. And he did serve in Reconstruction. During Reconstruction, served 2 terms in the Alabama legislature.
As a Republican?
As a radical Republican. My father always made it clear, as a radical Republican. But he wasn't the architect, because by the time he got elected, Reconstruction was already closing down. But my great-grandfather, the gentleman in the picture, for the next 40 years never stopped giving up on this idea that people of color had a rightful place in politics. So he continued to be active in national Republican politics, attended 4 national Republican conventions, and raised a family. And my father grew up hearing about him and was determined to, as a matter of family honor, restore black people to their rightful place in politics in Alabama. That was what my father was all about.
Sheryll Cashin, why did you write about your family? What made you take it this far?
Well, I got tired of hearing my father say he was going to write a book. You know, I just wanted to say, well, you know, excuse my French, but damn it, go, you know, if you're not going to write this book. I was terrified that this incredible lore would die with him. And so in my mid-40s, early 40s, I should say, I finally just got tired of hearing him talk about it, and I just took out a tape recorder and started interviewing him. I wanted to know everything he knew and be sure it didn't get lost. I started interviewing about what he knew about the family, but also about this political party and everything he did, and it took on a life of its own. And I started researching you know, how much of this lore was true, and it just became an obsession.
What did you find as far as how truthful the lore was?
Well, this was some of what, be careful what you wish for, you know. If you go off in search of your family history, you'll find that some things are true and some are not. One of the chief parts of our lore was that we descended from a benevolent Irishman named John Cashin, who was never a slave owner.
A white man.
A white man, Irish immigrant. The lore was this guy, John Cashin, and his brother James came over to the U.S. during the potato famine, and that one was a slave owner and one was not, and we descended from the benevolent non-slave owning guy. Not true. We did descend from this guy, John Cashin, but inconveniently, he was a slave owner. And not only was he a slave owner, the father of my great-grandfather.
Herschel's father.
Herschel's father. That guy's father, who was also named John, was one of the more prominent slave owners in Augusta. So here I have to contend with, not only did I descend from slavery, but I descended from wealth, considerable wealth born of slavery. And I could tie my family's history of relative advantage, 4 generations of educated people. My great-grandfather had a classical education in Philadelphia at the Institute for Colored Youth and became a lawyer. I can tie that to wealth born of slavery, which was new and a revelation. And I reconciled myself to that history by what my great-grandfather chose to do with that. He chose to go back to the South, which he didn't have to, and he chose to work for the uplift of people of color. And he chose to identify with people of color when, in fact, several of his siblings were pale enough to pass, and they did pass. He was a bit of an agitator as well. So that was one thing that I discovered.
Professor Cashin, what was your childhood like in Huntsville, Alabama?
Oh, I had an incredible childhood, almost from birth. My mother, Joan Carpenter Cashin, took me with her in her arms to a sit-in in April of 1962. I was 4 months old. She gets herself arrested with me in her arms. That event was a turning point in the sit-in movement in Huntsville, Alabama. Within a few months of that event, they had negotiated a nonviolent desegregation of public accommodations in Huntsville 2 full years before the Civil Rights Act, before the water hoses in Birmingham.
Did it help that Huntsville was an educated city, that it was in northern Alabama? Did that make any differences?
What helped, I think, more than anything was that Huntsville had tied its fate to the space industry. And there were, Werner von Braun was already there. A lot of people, a lot of engineers and scientists had descended on Alabama, and the city wanted to disassociate itself from the rabid racist image of the rest of the state, and that helped them, to negotiate this quietly. So yeah, from the beginning, I have memories of. So my parents were civil rights activists, and after the Civil Rights Act passes and the Voting Rights Act, then they turned to politics. I grew up licking NDPA stamps. That was the party, the National Democratic Party of Alabama. I have memories of, my father ran for governor against George Wallace in 1970. And I just have these memories of my summers being taken all around the state, particularly the black belt of the state, those counties that were the center of the plantation economy during the antebellum era, not surprisingly 100 years later, were where all the black votes were. And it felt like, particularly during that election of 1970, that it felt like I had been carried to every black church in the Black Belt, and I watched my father give this stump speech over and over and over again, invoking Frederick Douglass, the famous lines, "Those who profess to deprecate agitation are like the people who want the crops without plowing up the ground." And that's where the line comes from. Frederick Douglass, the title, The Agitator's Daughter. Frederick Douglass was my father's hero. He was always quoting him. But when he was on the campaign trail in the Black Belt, speaking to these dirt-poor sharecroppers, trying to give them a reason to register, vote, and go to the polls, he would always invoke Douglass and say, don't sit around waiting for other people to do right by you. As Frederick Douglass says, power concedes nothing without a demand. go forth and demand your power at the ballot box.
Sheryll Cashin, what do you teach here at Georgetown?
I'm a professor of law. I teach a